Welcome to the Coaching Revealed podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Matzelle. In this episode of Coaching Revealed, we explore ADHD coaching and the pioneering work of Elizabeth Ahmann and Micah Saviet, directors of the Springer Institute and recipients of a research grant from the Institute of Coaching and International Coaching Federation. Liz and Micah describe ADHD not as a deficit of intelligence, but as a neurodevelopmental condition with significant implications on executive functioning, often tied to motivation and emotional regulation. This episode explores the current research landscape of ADHD coaching. Liz and Micah identify major gaps, especially around adults in one-on-one coaching. Their findings underscore the importance of psychoeducation, structured accountability, and lived experience-informed coaching approaches. They also highlight the wellness challenges faced by adults with ADHD, emphasizing strategies that work, breaking tasks into manageable steps, increasing accountability touchpoints, and most importantly, addressing the shame and criticism that so many clients carry. Looking forward, Liz and Micah preview their upcoming book, which will integrate evidence, theory, and practice into a comprehensive resource for coaches, therapists, and practitioners. As directors, they also share the mission of the Springer Institute as it continues to bridge the gap between research and practice by making ADHD coaching studies accessible to the wider coaching community. And now, our conversation with Liz and Micah.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this episode of Coaching Revealed. Today, Austin and I are so thrilled to have Elizabeth Ahmann and Micah Saviet with us. Elizabeth has a master's degree in nursing and a doctorate in public health, the latter from the Johns Hopkins University. She is director of research at Springer Institute and professor and curriculum manager in the health and wellness coaching department at Maryland University of Integrative Health. In addition to a coaching practice focused on clients with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, she's a member of the ADHD Coaches Organization Research Committee, a published author, and an international conference presenter. Micah Saviet is the director of Springer Institute and is continually engaged in conducting and disseminating research related to ADHD and coaching with the ultimate aim of helping individuals cope more effectively and thrive. Micah is a holistic therapist in adult trauma and ADHD solutions, utilizing transformative somatic modalities focused at the intersection of trauma and neurodivergence. Micah is also an ADHD and well-being coach at Pathways Ahead. He is a published author and international conference presenter. So super excited to be speaking with you both today. My first question is, what got you both interested in coaching?
My background is in nursing and public health. And so I had that kind of a little bit of an analytic bent as well as a human-centered bent. And my children and my husband have ADHD, so I was learning a lot about it. And a psychologist I happen to know told me about this relatively new field of ADHD coaching. And I was like, what is that? And I got curious and I started looking into it. And I just was very impressed by the client-centered approach and the strengths-based focus of coaching. So that was when I started to pursue some training and coaching myself.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having Liz and I on the show. We really appreciate it and are just pleasure to be here. I'll just add that, Liz and I have both always been drawn to the kind of strength-based whole person approaches for supporting and assisting others with behavior change. And as helping professionals, we have seen the gap between, what clients are hoping or desiring to achieve or have been given recommendations from their healthcare providers and their physicians between what they're actually able to implement to achieve their desired results. So as well-being coaches, we have been drawn to help empower individuals in addressing the gap between where they are now and where they want to be.
That's awesome. And how did you two connect to do this powerful, amazing work together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Liz was actually one of my coaches back when I was in college, and I was fascinated with research, and then I kind of got involved from there. And she took me under her wing to teach me all she knows.
Love it.
That's so wonderful. It's great to see, both of you on this interview and to see the connection you all have and then the work you both are getting into within the Springer Institute and ADHD coaching. For individuals who maybe don't know a lot about ADHD or specifically ADHD in adults, can we kind of get a big picture overview on what is ADHD and how it appears in adults or adults who are seeking coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are three formally recognized types of ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's an inattentive type, predominantly hyperactive type, or like a third type, which is a combination of both inattentive and hyperactive features. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition that involves impairments with the executive functions. And this means that there are actual functional and structural differences in the brain of someone with ADHD versus someone without ADHD. So if we were to put those brains under an MRI scanner, we could see functional differences. It's important to know that ADHD is not related to intelligence. And I always tell my clients that, in fact, many people with ADHD have above average intelligence.
I'd like to add also, there's a common myth that ADHD is a disorder of childhood and that once you get to be an adult, people outgrow it. But that's not true for everyone. Some people maintain ADHD into adulthood. And in fact, there are some people who are newly diagnosed in adulthood. That last population is increasingly recognized.
And I'll add on to that. In fact, ADHD is often more impairing of a condition for adults because they don't have built-in support structures and systems that are often common in family and a school system. So by the time individuals reach adulthood, they often have experiences of compensating and learning to mask symptoms to really cope and get by with life that has often led to a great deal of frustration and shame as well. Low self-esteem from a history of criticism. So ADHD in adulthood can be really impairing and really difficult.
That's why I think we have a big interest in exploring coaching for adults with ADHD and just in general support for adults with ADHD because their support needs are often less recognized, as Micah was saying, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited to then, in a little bit, we'll get more into the research that you both are involved in within this field of adults who have ADHD and coaching adults with ADHD. And Liz, you talked on this a little bit, but just want to do a little bit more of a dive on your background. Since you have that background in nursing, what was it about the coaching approach that kind of brought you from a career in nursing to fully jumping into this career in coaching?
Yeah, so the biggest distinction I would draw is nursing, like many helping professions, is kind of an expert-oriented approach to working with people. You know things and you may teach them things. I had been actually doing a lot of work in the pediatric nursing field, trying to help nurses understand patient-centered care and what that looked like. So I had a appreciation for the importance of patient-centered care. And then when I began learning about coaching and I saw coaching is completely a client-centered profession, I was fascinated and really wanted to learn more. And so that's when I started my coach training.
That's amazing. And it's such an interesting and powerful collaboration that you both are doing, where it sounds like, Liz, you're coming from the lens of wanting to help others around you that have ADHD. And Micah, you shared that you are an adult living with it. That, pairing of having personal experience and then the external experience is something really interesting that we'll tap into. But Micah, since you're living as an adult with ADHD, how did your personal experience really shape your involvement with the research?
I do bring that personal experience lens as an adult with ADHD. And in fact, as I mentioned, as a college student, ADHD coaching was an instrumental part of my success. While it still did take me over 7 years to get through my undergrad degree, coaching was what helped me graduate. So I really recognize the importance of coaching from a personal lens. And maybe it's a feature of my own ADHD. When I see that something works, I tend to hyperfixate and get really fascinated with it. So combined with my ongoing fascination with research methods and methodologies and all things like that, I was able to kind of keep pestering Liz to help me get involved in her research agenda. And that's when she really took me under her wing. I had able to learn from her and then in more recent years, really be a co-contributor and an equal collaborator.
Liz, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add this, if this is okay. It's more about how I became interested in research on coaching. So when I became a coach, my training was really focused, as much coach training is, on practice and competency-based learning. And that gave me a wonderful and solid foundation for coaching. But at the same time, because I had this background in nursing and this research training in public health, I had this specific lens of looking at evidence-based practice that was a particular interest of mine. And so as I entered the ADHD coaching field, I became really interested in what does the research say about ADHD coaching? And that's how I really started exploring and pursuing research in this field.
I'm wondering what was available when you first started doing this in terms of the information in the research space compared to now, since you've been working in this for years.
So when I began to look at the research on ADHD coaching, I found it a little difficult to track down studies. There is a Journal of Attention Disorders, but it didn't have much about coaching. So I had to really search the literature and also what's called gray literature, like online. I found PowerPoint presentation or conference symposia that talked about research studies. At that point, I collected studies for my own interest, but I thought it would be really useful to summarize those studies so that other coaches could understand what the research said about the field, and also other practitioners so that they could understand the evidence base for coaching, and also for potential clients to know there was an evidence base to this field. So that's kind of the evolution from the beginning. And since then, there are definitely more studies now. There are some particular areas that even still we hope there will be additional research in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it sounds like if you're at a place within analyzing the field of research for ADHD coaching, and you're getting into that place of gray literature or gray research, as you referenced, and looking at what's existing maybe at conferences, it sounds like the field at the initiation was pretty small. There wasn't a lot of like randomized control trials, double-blind studies, things like that, if I'm not being too presumptuous.
You're right. There was actually one randomized control study at the time. I found 19 studies when we were looking at the literature. What's interesting about them, and in the literature review that we pulled together, I think it was 2018, the majority of those studies were on college students, 10 of the 19. I think because college students are an easy group to study because they're kind of captive and you can access them through disability support services and so forth. But there were a few studies on high school students, one I think on elementary school. There were only 2 studies on adults with ADHD, which was really interesting. So just a little bit about that research. There was variation we noticed in the training of coaches. There was variation in the frequency and duration of the coaching engagement. So there were differences across the studies. At the same time, all 19 studies found improvements in either ADHD or executive functioning or related behaviors. So it was a really clear direction in the research. Some of the studies were small, only one was an RCT, but every study was consistently showing that with 8 to 10 sessions of coaching, there were improvements. And some of the studies looked at self-esteem, a couple at family functioning.
Another really important finding that was looked at in 3 of the studies in our 2018 narrative review, which is really important for the field of coaching at large, is whether gains were maintained from the coaching intervention over time. And 3 of these studies did report that gains made during the coaching was sustained, and even a few gains were improved. So that's a really important consideration and marker when we look at effectiveness of any type of coaching, in particular ADHD coaching.
9 of those studies we looked at explored patient or client, I guess would be the better word, satisfaction, and some were qualitative and some were, survey approaches to the question. But all 9 of those 9 studies found that participants either were satisfied with coaching or found it very useful or whatever. And so that was a little indication to us about what the client experience might be like, even though at that time we hadn't found research on that.
I do also want to just ask one small clarifying question. I don't think Emily and I got to this just yet with you both. What year, Liz, did you start doing this research?
I began looking for the literature for my own purposes probably in 2016, maybe. I think we pulled some of the literature together. By 2017, we had an article in Pediatric Nursing on the studies of ADHD coaching for children and youth. And then in 2018, we had our study that looked at our narrative review of all the 19 studies published in the Journal of Postsecondary Education.
Within your 2018 narrative review, you've talked a little bit about some of these trends that emerged with the efficacy of the coaching on individuals with ADHD. I'm wondering what were potentially additional findings or gaps that you were noticing within the research that you wanted to begin exploring more?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess I'll just emphasize again that one wonderful finding for the field was that all studies pointed to some benefits of coaching for participants. So those were overall positive outcomes. So that was one clear takeaway. I think I mentioned that over half of the studies were college students. So that was a really strong body of literature for the effectiveness of ADHD coaching for college students. One thing that really struck us as researchers was the fact that only 2 of the studies explored coaching for adults. And both of those were based on group coaching experience. But at the same time, we knew that a lot of coaches work with individual adults with ADHD, and there was no research at the time looking at that experience.
So this really raised questions for us because we know anecdotally there are many coaches who work with adults with ADHD. We became really curious about what are the outcomes of individual coaching for adults with ADHD. And I'll just mention here that, we are very fortunate to have received this grant from the Institute of Coaching, International Coaching Federation, their coaching research grant for this mixed method study of coaching for adults with ADHD. So our data collection has already wrapped up, and we're currently in the process of finishing up our analysis. And we look forward to sharing both quantitative and qualitative findings of this study when they're ready for publication and dissemination.
I don't know if maybe you can tease out a little bit, but is there anything that's surprising or that you weren't really expecting as you're starting to, compile results and get findings?
I guess one thing I could say about the qualitative research is that the participants were very eager to share, and they really shared a lot with us. So we have a very rich body of qualitative data that we're analyzing and able to report on. And maybe the other thing about the quantitative part of our study is it had 2 components. One looked at like pre and post measures around the coaching. And then we did do a short look at maintenance of gains 6 weeks later. So that'll be interesting to see how that turns out.
Yeah, very cool. And shifting gears a little bit, can you explain to our listeners what the executive functioning framework is and how that's tying into the research?
Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that one. So executive functions is a really important part of understanding ADHD and therefore ADHD coaching. So there are different ways to conceptualize executive functions, or in shorthand, we just kind of say EFs. So fundamentally, executive functions are really the cognitive management system of our brain. And they happen in the prefrontal cortex. If you put your hand on your forehead, this is really where this prefrontal or neocortex is happening in the brain. And that part of the brain is what distinguishes us from really other mammals and other animals, this higher level of processing. So Dr. Thomas Brown has a nice conceptualization that he categorizes executive functions into 6 buckets. There's activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. So these typically work seamlessly. These processes work seamlessly together throughout the day, allowing us to arrive at work on time, juggling multiple sources of communication during the workday, text, email, conversations, and allowing us to have a smooth plan for the evening and dinner and wrap up. But that's what happens for a neurotypical person or someone without ADHD or a neurodivergent brain. So for individuals with ADHD, the prefrontal cortex is where we see some of those structural and functional differences in this compared to a neurotypical brain. So in ADHD, the result is that the executive functions we're talking about are impaired. So developing those skills and strategies to bolster these executive functions and creating practices and routines are a really important part of ADHD coaching that can help people to function easier.
Does ADHD impact all 6 buckets for every single individual? Is it a combination of these buckets? Can you explain a little bit about that?
I would say just as neurotypical people vary very much in, how we process. Some might be more visual, some, et cetera. People with ADHD vary in how things work for them, but it is typical that there are challenges with the executive functions. And a related challenge is actually a brain-based challenge with the motivation circuitry in the brain, the dopamine circuitry. So that's another aspect of ADHD that can make life challenging, and that often can be addressed in coaching as well.
And I'll just add, just as ADHD is a spectrum condition, right? It's a spectrum. It looks very different for different people. In fact, I think ADHD looks different for every person in many ways. So is executive function impairment as well, a spectrum for each of the buckets when you think about a continuum of challenge.
When this kind of space, as we're getting towards, the fundamental, some of the fundamental issues that the research and the work is showing it's impacting individuals with ADHD, with specifically the executive functioning, what are some of the methodologies or some of the frameworks that you see coaches utilizing that can be impactful in a positive way for individuals, adults with ADHD?
Like any coaching, ADHD coaching is client-centered and relies on frameworks such as self-determination and so forth. Just like any coaching, clients bring their own issues, questions, goals, and topics to the session. Just to say a little bit more about what ADHD is so you'll understand what's different with ADHD coaching. ADHD, we talked about the executive functions and motivation, and one way it's been described is as a gap between knowledge and ideas or thoughts or goals and action. And so it's in that implementation piece that it can be really challenging for people with ADHD. And again, that's because of the structure and function of the brain and that it works differently and impacts executive functioning and motivation.
In fact, they say ADHD is not an issue of knowing what to do, but a challenge of doing what you intend or know you need to do.
So one thing that's a little bit different about ADHD coaching is that often it will involve some amount of what's called psychoeducation, which is helping clients understand ADHD, understand executive functions, and observe and appreciate how those are showing up in their own lives. And that can also help them determine, well, what areas of executive functioning they might want to particularly work on to help them in achieving what they want in their life.
And that understanding can be hugely liberating for individuals with ADHD to start to shift from the idea that there's something wrong with me to there's something different about my brain and I can be empowered with knowledge to understand my brain.
So that psychoeducation piece is one thing that's really different. Another thing I would say is different with ADHD coaching is we may get more granular on action steps and accountability. We may help clients really break actions into very small steps so they're manageable and that they can be repeated and built on to move in the direction more effectively. And accountability can be a really big piece of that for people with ADHD. So one study we did was actually focus group on between session communication, because that's a feature that's often part of ADHD coaching that's not always part of other coaching. Having your client check in with you midweek, because it helps keep them on track with what they're planning to do.
And I'll just add that in ADHD coaching, we often use kind of phrases to help clients remember things, kind of something like out of sight, out of mind. If you can't see the thing, then you may not think about the thing. If you don't know where to start, then it's too big. So these types of things can help individuals with ADHD learn about their brain and also shift out of trying to act or pretend like they're a neurotypical and do things that a neurotypical might do, which doesn't work for a brain with ADHD most of the time.
And that's where executive functioning comes in coaching. Coaches who are trained to work with people with ADHD have a deep level of understanding of executive functioning and ways to support people with executive functioning challenges. That executive functioning support and assistance with developing strategies to bolster those executive functions is also kind of a unique part of ADHD coaching.
As well as the lived experience, understanding the lived experience with ADHD, simply understanding about executive functions is not enough to really be a really effective ADHD coach.
In fact, there are 2 qualitative studies that interviewed adults with ADHD who had coaching experience. And one of the things they really liked about coaching was that many of their coaches had some lived experience, either personal or in a family member, of ADHD themselves. So that really allowed for a different kind of empathy and comfort for the client. So that we also found is a really interesting piece of the research.
So the rapport building between the client and coach here is very important, at least has been cited within the research to be important. And also the elements of the psychoeducation sound very important as well, and something that you don't always consider in other forms of coaching. A question that I have is kind of in the space of coaches recognizing issues with executive functioning in their clients. And I know, as we've mentioned before, all of us are unique individuals, and all individuals with ADHD may present slightly differently. So are there any potential signs, though, that can be seen across the board, or things that coaches can be looking for and noticing that may indicate that their client is dealing with a little bit more difficulty with their executive functioning?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is if clients are really having trouble putting action steps and plans in place, and or they might do it for a week or two and not be able to follow through further. I mean, that can happen to anyone in a busy life, but if that's a consistent pattern, I would ask myself, is this an executive functioning issue? If there's a lot of procrastination and if there's difficulty regulating emotions, those are some of the pieces that might show up with executive functioning. I mean, could be other things as well, but those definitely would be tips for me. Do you have any other thoughts, Micah?
Yeah, I think you covered some important ones there. And I'll just add that particularly when an emotional reactions may be getting in the way of effectively being able to implement goals, plans, or strategies, an often under-recognized aspect of ADHD, although it is one of the executive functions, is challenges with emotion and regulating emotion. So it's important to be aware of that for coaches that may be working with individuals with ADHD, but also recognizing, when to refer to a therapist and what is the scope of practice for a coach in working and helping people through some of those challenges.
The research that you're doing, does that focus on people that are already diagnosed, or have you gone into this realm of how can a coach recognize it? What do they do if there isn't a formal diagnosis yet? Because I know that comes up a lot of times in coaching conversations of, what's within the coaching realm versus what's some other type of, clinical provider maybe.
I'll just add one thing and then I'll let Liz answer the question. Of course, as coaches, we don't diagnose or prescribe, but being aware and having our keen listening ears as coaches, we're able to often, if we know what we're listening for, listen and hear some things that we might point out to the client that could be of further attention they may want to talk with other providers or get an assessment. In terms of the particular research, I'll let Liz answer.
First, I want to go back to this question of what distinguishes ADHD coaching. And I'd like to add that another piece is ADHD coaches often will be in a situation of working with clients who also have a therapist and or psychiatrist or other providers. So there's more often than you might have in other coaching, a need for interprofessional collaboration. And there's also a need for a good referral list to therapists or psychiatrists if you feel like, you're seeing things that are beyond just managing the executive functions and so forth. So that issue of scope of practice and the borders between practice and like therapy, for example, is a more keen issue in ADHD coaching. But Emily, you also asked about whether our research looked at this question. I really love your question, and I think it would be a great question for some future research. A lot of people who are coaching want to learn about ADHD coaching, and they want to be able to serve individuals with ADHD. They don't necessarily even know if they might be, and there can be frustration in the coaching relationship sometimes as a result. So I'm going to tuck that idea away for a future study.
Yeah, please do. That'd be amazing if your next research study came out of this conversation. But yeah, it came because it comes up often. I would imagine, and I've had in my own experience, that a client comes and ADHD just comes up in conversation, but that's not even necessarily the main focus of the coaching. So it's helpful both when you have clients that specifically have raised their hand that I'm dealing with this and I want a coach that can specifically help me cope with it and be successful. And then other times where it's just coming up as something that is secondary or tertiary in the coaching conversation. So it's helpful for any coach really to have awareness of what showcases, what highlights that this is something a client might be dealing with.
Yes, that's a really good point. And I think it's important for coaches who aren't trained as ADHD coaches to know that there is this specialty. So if there are issues they and their client are bumping up against, the client might need a referral to therapy if they don't already have a therapist. But an ADHD coach also has a very specialized way of coaching people with ADHD that is sometimes can be more effective than coaches who don't have that executive functioning background, the understanding of motivation in ADHD and so forth.
Yeah. And tied to that, how does ADHD impact goals or wellness goals for individuals?
So, as you may not be surprised to know, wellness can be particularly difficult, to maintain and achieve and sustain for adults with ADHD. And this is, right, not surprisingly due to compromised executive functions and also the motivation pathways that Liz had mentioned. So we just think about it, when we have trouble keeping track of time, organizing our space, keeping track of our keys, meal planning, these are all barriers to being able to initiate and stick with and be consistent with wellness goals, whatever those may look like for each person.
What I have found myself both interesting and a little upsetting to know is that experts now frame ADHD also as almost in epidemiological terms, in terms of its impact on life activities in those domains. For example, there was a longitudinal study of young adults with a childhood diagnosis of ADHD, and they were found to have significantly reduced healthy lifespan, actual lifespan, and reduction in life expectancy by adulthood. Another study of adults with ADHD found that they were 4 to 5 times more likely to have challenges in health realms and wellness realms than neurotypical counterparts. And that can cross self-care, mental well-being, relationships, physical well-being, health, and even legal and accident proneness. So really, the need for well-being support for individuals with ADHD, in our view, is a very important issue to address.
Considering all of these different factors, I know we've talked a little bit about some of the coaching processes that are unique to ADHD coaching, but just to kind of expand on this space, what are, maybe the different overarching features, or what is like the big picture for ADHD coaching? What processes are impactful for your clients dealing with these issues?
Yeah, I think there are really 5 categories that Liz and I could summarize in terms of representing unique processes for ADHD coaching. And I'll share maybe the first 2 here, and I'll have Liz share the other 3. So installation of hope is kind of how I would capture this first one. And that is, many individuals, particularly we're speaking about, adults, but also other age groups with ADHD have a history of criticism, shame, low self-esteem. There's some statistic floating out there on the internet, individuals with ADHD have an average of, 20,000 additional corrections or criticisms before the age of 15 or 12. As you might imagine, this takes a significant toll on people's sense of self, identity, and self-efficacy. So working to instill some sense of hope when you're working with this population is really important.
In fact, we did a study, focus group study of experienced ADHD coaches trying to help us develop a kind of manualized intervention or approach for what happens in ADHD coaching and in part what distinguishes it, but what it looks like. And one of the big pieces that they brought up was the importance when working with adults who have ADHD of addressing issues of shame because of this history of criticism that many people have lived with. So definitely that installation of hope was key.
And our second area that's unique to ADHD coaching is, as we've been mentioning so far in this episode, is psychoeducation, right? Around understanding that this is not a moral failing, a personal failing, a personality defect. It's a brain-based difference, having ADHD, and its impact on executive function and motivation. And it is not a form of laziness. It's a structural difference in the brain.
Yes, so kind of following on that structural difference, the other piece, and we've mentioned this, is executive functioning support. So helping individuals both understand the executive functions, which is part of psychoeducation, and then to develop skills and strategies to work more effectively with their challenges and bolster and build some executive functioning skills. Another thing, a fourth way that ADHD coaching is a little bit different and unique is more frequent use of between session communication because of the motivation challenges and the executive functioning challenges that impact follow through. That between session communication, when a client is interested in it, can be a way to give them accountability between sessions to keep them moving on their goals. And then the fifth way I think ADHD coaching is different, and this doesn't necessarily show up in training or whatever, but in fact, many people who are ADHD coaches have some lived experience, personal or in a family member with ADHD. And 2 qualitative studies have pointed out that that factor is very important to many of the people who come to ADHD coaching in terms of building an alliance, feeling fully understood.
Awesome. And we know that you are slated to release a book next year in 2026. What frameworks and guidelines will bring all this together and be in the book? Can you give us a sneak peek of what's in the book, or maybe the impact that you hope it will have?
This book has been a really exciting process for us, and it was stimulated when we were conducting these focus groups with experienced coaches, and particularly around this issue of shame that many adults with ADHD feel. And we were curious, what are the best ways to promote well-being in this population? We've long seen a need for a strengths-focused book on supporting adults with ADHD, and that focus group really kind of just stimulated our interests.
Yeah, so the specific, so we set out to write this book, right, that might help coaches, therapists, and other practitioners as well, working with adults with ADHD. And we really bring together key theories, evidence from both the well-being literature as behavior change science, as well as research on ADHD. And we have a lot of concrete examples of best practices for working with adults with ADHD. And I'll just add that, a unique feature of this book is that it's not specifically designed as a self-help book for adults with ADHD, of which there are increasing numbers available wonderfully. However, adults with ADHD may benefit from reading our book, but there are few resources for practitioners, coaches, therapists, and others who work with adults who have ADHD, outside of a few cognitive behavioral therapy focused manuals. We chose to gear this book towards therapists and coaches and other helping professionals to really, as Liz is saying, to support this well-being perspective.
And for us, it was really important expression of our commitment to ADHD coaching, because many approaches to working with individuals with ADHD focus on correcting negative symptoms or fixing challenges. And ADHD coaches, and in this book, we also take a really different approach. It's really focused on positive support for well-being in all of its aspects, including supporting well-being in lifestyle for individuals with ADHD, promoting growth mindset, applying self-determination theories to working with the adults with ADHD.
Cultural considerations, motivation, specific chapters on these elements. We've talked about motivation, psychoeducation, executive functions, and specific approaches to help practitioners learn how to do this.
So it's very theory-oriented and ADHD layered on that, and then practical applications kind of all put together.
A lot of what Liz and I have focused on is that kind of, research to practice pipeline and kind of helping coaching move forward in that realm. And, we anticipate that this book will be a really useful evidence-based guide to helping facilitate client well-being. And I'll just put a plug in. If you want to be aware of when this book is released, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Springer Institute, or you can subscribe to our mailing list, very infrequent mailing list on our website. And then we'll be letting you know about when it's coming out on either of those channels.
We're happy to say we've turned it over to the publishers. So now it's their time frame, which will be spring to summer of 2026. It should be in print.
So exciting. Congratulations. So we unfortunately have to start to wrap up. So you just mentioned the Springer Institute and the goals that you have with this book, which sounds so helpful and practical. But just curious about what your personal goals are with the book, with your organization, and how that will support you with the impact that you intend to have with adults with ADHD.
Yeah, great question. So Springer Institute was founded 5 years ago, and I'll just share that we are a leader in research and promoting of evidence-informed practices related to coaching for ADHD as well as health and wellness. We hold a mastermind group to support professionals and students and researchers who are studying ADHD coaching. We've had some international members in that group. We have a list of all of our own publications. We make as many available open access to researchers and coaches as we can. We also want to let listeners know that we have a specific free resource on our website, which is a digital database where we house all research related to ADHD coaching. We currently have over 60 publications listed on there in a way that you can search at your own leisure. We have study citations and link to full text if available. So we're really trying to make research accessible and easy to find or related to ADHD coaching.
Yeah, so the vision of Springer related to that is really this research to practice translation and making research available to coaches and conducting research about practice that can feed back into evidence-based practice.
I really love that so much. It's a really similar mission to what the Institute of Coaching has as well, which is, translating the research into practice. And it's also really inspiring to hear, you both were kind of starting on this institute not too long ago, under 10 years ago. And that initial study you did a survey of all the research in 2018. You said about 19 studies, and on your website now on Springer Institute, there's around 60 cited sources people can look to. So you're doing so much wonderful work to kind of amass all the research around ADHD coaching. We're so glad to get to, give you all an opportunity to talk more about this and see where the research can go when how to increase the impact of this work.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for the opportunity to talk about our field of ADHD coaching and our research interests, and to put a little plug in for our book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. It's so great to get to talk with you all. And to all our listeners, thank you. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Terrani with Coaching Revealed.